Thank you very much, Vincent. I'm greatly honored to be here at this symposium, Rogers Symposium. And coming after such heavyweights for the rest of the day, I'm afraid it's going to be maybe downhill from here. Uh, so the questions, my motivation comes from the question that Roger posed the other day: why is democratic state building so hard? Why do some countries fail to establish democracy? And countries where, even if they establish democracy, it is marked by pervasive corruption, ineffective public good provision, in spite of increasing electoral participation. I'm not going to give you answers to any of these questions. I'm going to one case study, which is a country that I know most, Pakistan, where I'm going to show some evidence that throws some light on these questions. So here is Pakistan. Pakistan formed in 1947. State building is the major challenge in Pakistan ever since. The country had no historical basis for an identity to a state called Pakistan or this region. And the whole region was driven by different kinds of cleavages. For instance, the largest province, Balochistan, Balochs are divided between Pakistan and Iran, and there's been ongoing insurgency, fierce insurgency in both countries ever since, right now as we speak, in both countries. Sindh was only, before partition, only a few years ago separated from Bombay presidency, whereas Punjab was separated from eastern Punjab, which went to India. Frontier province, now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where Pashtuns live, where they also live here. There is only an artificial boundary, Durand line, that separates Pashtuns living on this side of the border from Pashtuns living in Afghanistan. Kashmir, we all know, is again. So no wonder Salman Rushdie famously called in his book, novel Shame, Pakistan a failure of the dreaming mind. Perhaps it was insufficiently imagined. But I'm going to argue it's not only Pakistan. Pakistan is not that atypical, so it's very typical of many African countries, other countries where identity and similar issues are very common to ethnic cleavages, others are very common to Pakistan, to issue faced in Pakistan. So 6 to 7 decades later, Pakistan is a semi-functional state. It's not a failed state completely. There is some state building in 3 of the nationalities because of economic linkages, barring Balochistan. However, it's still a state which is extremely fragile, I would say. And Pakistan, for a variety of reasons that I don't need to go in, does matter both for peace and stability in Pakistan, matters for both itself, Afghanistan, rest of the region, and possibly the world. Before showing some evidence, let me tell you some stylized facts from Pakistan's experience of state building. So the major fault lines or recurrent features of Pakistan's experience with state building are the following, as I would argue. It is primarily determined by the tension, institutional imbalance between the elected and the unelected organs of the state. The unelected being the military and bureaucracy to begin with, now only the military, and politicians. So this has led to cycles of instability, 4 different martial law military regime, more than half of the country's history, more than 30 years being ruled by the military, the other, the semi-control from the shadows. So that's the primary feature. So democracy is still not established, and I'll go into some of the reasons. The other major feature is, for a state driven by ethnic cleavages, its experience of state building has been marked by an inability of ethnic groups to find a working political balance. It's a federal democratic state, but again, I'll go into some of the tension of what that means for state building. The other being a coherent national identity and especially ideological division of the role of Islam. That started right from the time of independence. Is it an Islamic state, or is it a state for Muslims who choose to live separately in one part of this part of the world? it was used by the unelected organs of the state to bolster their claims that a national security paradigm, Islam as a unifying ideology against a Hindu India. The other features, economy, it was marked by low fiscal capacity and low investment in public good provision. I would say that there would be like a consensus among the elite, both the military as well as the politically, not to choose in fiscal capacity, and to basically rely on, in this particular case, there are no natural resources, but aid, concessional flows, or other income from rents from outside. I can give you many figures, but just to give you one example, the tax to GDP ratio, 9%, is lower than the developing countries' average of 15%. Less than 1% of the people filed returns, 0.9%, compared to like 4.6% in India, other countries, more than 10% in most of the developing countries, barring Africa. If you go by the measure, I work in this area, the taxation and public finance. If you look into the taxable income of people and how many should actually be paying taxes, so it's roughly 1/6. 17% of the people who should be filing can be verified as filing tax returns are paying their taxes. So huge levels of evasion of taxes. And obviously it leads to low investment and productive capabilities of the state. So it's become like a rentier state where connection with the state matters in terms of generating economic rents. The threat of religious fundamentalist groups is more of an issue for the past 3 decades, where the state has itself relaxed its legitimate monopoly over violence by establishing groups that use violence as an instrument of state policy, initially to begin with in Afghanistan and then elsewhere. And now it is within Pakistan. And in the spirit of what Tim Toston and Asim Aglu and others say, all of political and economic development being code-determined, so all of these are linked in that way, in that the narrative of the state that developed after independence was a national security state, dominated by the unelected organs of the state being the primary guarantors of the state security, versus the identity being defined in terms of Islam as the legitimizing principle, ideology, versus a Hindu India that was bent on destroying the state, and with the state institutions, strong center, which had a role in denying ethnic aspirations of the ethnic constituent units, especially in the first 25 years of the majority. The majority was the Bengalis, who constituted a majority. The politics in the first quarter century of independence was all based on denying the majority and their fair share in policy formulation. And the rise of religious fundamentalist groups, especially in the Afghan jihad, being an instrument of state policy, with peculiar their effects on violence, both abroad, but also increasingly in the past couple of decades within the state. I'll come to this issue of Taliban at the end, because I think that the threat posed by Taliban constitutes a very different, qualitatively different challenge than any other threat that has been faced by Pakistan so far. So what does this results in? A systemic failure of governance, cycles of instability, democracy being not established. This was the first government ever in Pakistan's history that completed its tenure and transitioned to another civilian government. Otherwise, no civilian government ever completed its tenure. Was overthrown by the establishment backed by the military. And in terms of development outcomes, although Pakistan did have a decent economic growth rates, especially in the first 40 years, it had economic growth which was higher than in case of India, especially till the early 1990 Indian economic reforms. But with the major share of state spending being going to defense and other to establishment and sustenance of the security state, it led to a huge, significant social deficit, no matter which way you measure, whether you measure it through with neighboring countries, countries at the same level of development, countries which had the same growth level over the past 50 years. So whichever way you see, you compare Pakistan with these comparator countries, you see a huge social deficit in terms of education, investments in education, health, and other investments in people. This is what Easterley called paradox of growth without development. Again, even in the periods where elections have regularly taken place, we see the political system being very competitive. I'll show you some evidence for that. We also see citizen preference for public goods, but we see a political system that doesn't deliver on public goods. And I'm going to say something about this paradox. So what I'm going to say and not rigorously establish is that local democracy constitute one of the solutions to this through the selection effect. Reference to the discussion that we were having at tea with Tim. I'm agnostic about the steady state role of decentralization in Pakistan. But as far as the dynamic effect of decentralization in bringing a new class of political leaders who could hopefully break the current low-level political equilibrium and take it to a different, I do think decentralization and local democracy has a role. I'm not over-claiming it. There could be other solutions. I'll mention a few. So why is this? How can local governments democratize the state? I think we have heard enough from Roger and others. I don't want to go, these are theoretical arguments. So the primary argument is this ladder for advancement. So in theory, local democracy, by opening up the space for entry into politics by new political leaders, where they could build their reputation for good governance and then compete the politicians at the senior levels. The other argument being, if done rightly, it could strengthen political accountability. But again, we know from literature that decentralization is not a solution, and Jean-Paul talked quite a lot about that. So I won't go into these things. Again, it could broaden the base from which political leadership is drawn, as again part of that selection argument, and I'll say something about some of the evidence that shows this. And most importantly, it could also build or strengthen linkages between political parties and citizens. But if you look at Pakistan's historical experience of decentralization, are these benefits realized? Is there any evidence of that? So I'll first show you evidence against this, so because Pakistan's historical experience completely goes against this argument. So as I did a few papers with my co-authors, including one with Marson, we show the Pakistan's historical experience shows a counter-cyclical pattern of national and local democracy. So in the period that you have national democracy, you don't have local democracy. And where you don't have democracy at the central level, you have local democracy, established by a non-representative regime, military regimes in particular, who use local governments as a legitimizing strategy, basically. So that pattern started from the pre-independence years. If you trace the history of local government from the mid-19th century to mid-20th century, at the time of independence, exactly the same pattern. Basically, the colonial governments also use ever-increasing levels of decentralization, basically to co-opt local elites into as a part of a legitimizing strategy by the state. The same strategy continued afterwards. So 1947 to 58, we had a civilian regime, political elected regime, although there were no elections in this period, so I wouldn't, but no local democracy. 58 to 71, we had two military regimes, General Ayub and General Zia's martial laws. So they instituted basic democracies in 1959 and municipal administration ordinance in 1960, basically as a legitimizing strategy, and where they denied democracy at the central levels and disbanded parliaments and used these basic democracies as electoral college for the president, basically as a legitimizing strategy for a military regime. 71 to 77, after the 71 war and breakup of Bangladesh, we had the PPP regime of Bhutto. Again, in fact, they introduced 2 local government legislation but never implemented them. They were never serious in implementing them. 77 to 88, General Ziaul's military regime, they introduced a local government system. 98 to 88 to 99, another period of civilian control, different parties ruled by Nawaz Sharif and Benazir, no local democracy. 99 to 2008, General Musharraf devolved district governments. 2008, again we have civilian regimes, and I'll say more about this. So again, there is some evidence that this historical pattern may be broken now. So as I said, local governments are used as legitimizing strategies by non-representative centers. However, there is one change. Because politics change over this period, increasing urbanization, rise of mass political parties in the 60s, and mass urban protests, which in case of Pakistan were instrumental in changing governments. And in one case in 1983, mass rural protest also, although all other cases were cases of mass urban protest having instituted either change in government or having posed enough threat to the government that for the government to appear to be responsive. So all of those episodes of decentralization, in fact, if you go before that to the British period also, involved increasing concessions to the representative institutions. In fact, the last one, which as a civil servant I also helped implement, was quite a decent decentralization exercise with quite empowered district governments, although done for the wrong reason, done as a legitimizing strategy for the military government, thereby creating animosity with both provincial governments, but also with political parties who saw them as rival sources of power, also as stalking horses which could be used by non-representative regimes in future against them. So I think already said that local political institutions were designed to create a disjuncture between higher tier and local level democracy. So all of those episodes of local democracy that I mentioned, because their political economy was used as a legitimizing and not as an empowering strategy, so there were distortions in the design. All of them, for instance, involved non-partisan elections, non-political party-based elections, which was again an attempt to create a power base or a loyal base of supporters, which could be co-opted with the government. Again, something that created animosity with the political parties, but again prevented these local governments from playing any role. In fact, led them to playing an anti-democratic role, as I would say. So the elections were also indirect, non-party elections, and as we show in one of the papers, these made the local governments accountable to a very narrow set of voters. Again, although increasingly less so over a later period, but these local governments were underfunded, restricted mandates, excessive bureaucratic control, although less so in the last set of reforms instituted by Musharraf. So why do I think that despite this evidence, despite this historical evidence, Pakistan and from Pakistan, local democracy could still play a role in? It is because Pakistan's democratic system remains excessively dynastic. So this is something that Tim mentioned, and I'm going to show some evidence. And it has persisted over the past 5-6 decades. In elections, and the political system has not eroded it, in fact, it has reinforced it. What this results is underperformance of public and pro-poor services, and the system is prone to significant elite capture. So I'm going to show you some evidence from the dynastic nature of the politics and the micro nature of the politics that shows the elite nature of politics, and one reason as to why local democracy could play a role in breaking it. So this work done by my colleague Ali Chima and his colleagues. So the paradox in Pakistan's electoral history is that elections are very competitive, but at the same time, there's a widely held view that elections are, the political system is very uncompetitive. For instance, a 5% percentage point swing in votes between the candidates could result in unseating of the incumbent 30% seats. In 30% of the seats, just a 5 percentage point swing of the votes could lead to the incumbent being defeated. So that's a huge, like a small margin of vote shift, swing votes, could lead to a big result in the electoral outcome. But still, so what accounts for this paradox is because the political class is heavily dominated by dynasties, held together by ties of blood and marriage, which restrict the entry of non-dynastic politicians into the political class. So while politics appears competitive as members of dynastic factions aggressively compete against each other, it is simultaneously uncompetitive because the dynasties and their pursuit of their interest trumps other concerns, development concerns, public policy, and other concerns. For instance, in case of Punjab, it is 400 families that control 2/3 of the seats in the provincial and national assemblies in Punjab, which is a huge, big number. So these are the numbers from Punjab, the National Assembly representatives elected from Punjab. So this is in the race. Obviously, there is less dynasticism in the race because more people compete. And the blue line shows dynasticism of those who actually get elected. And as you can see, it's a very high number. So roughly like 2/3 of those who get elected belong to these families, so dynastic families. And roughly there are 400 families. So this is based on a unique data set that they developed and coded. Compare it to other countries. Using the same definition for a dynasty as these other papers show. So in the US, it is the proportion of dynastic legislators in the House in Pakistan is far, far, far higher than any other comparator countries. Roughly 6% in the US in this period. The Civil War period, which was considered in the literature as again a period which was held captive by insiders, again it was only 10%. In India, where again there is much talk about dynasties, 28%. Compared to say 53% in the whole National Assembly, in Punjab it's even bigger. So this is a map of Punjab with areas which are, the red areas are where the number of dynastic candidates is 3. As you go more darker, more dynastic capture. There's scope here for doing other work also, maybe on the micro outcomes, economic outcomes, others. But so far, this is just to illustrate. So who are these dynasts? Majority being sons, some being paternal nephews, son-in-laws, other close blood relatives. In a very few cases, daughters also. So this was one piece of evidence. And although I don't establish, but the evidence is suggestive that the political elite or political class in Pakistan is very narrow and limited. And that's why I'll give you an argument as to why I think that local democracy could be one channel where one could bring new people or entry into the political class. So another argument is how micro-politics works, how politics below the level of these MNAs and MPs, how that works. So at the level of the villages and bradaris, politics is organized by individuals who organize vote factions, dhadas in local parlance, or aggregators as they've been called in political science literature. So these are informal social agents. They're not political party cadres because parties don't exist at that level. And that's one of the major reasons as to what the weakness of the political system in Pakistan. The absence of organized political parties. And parties having to rely on these informal aggregators and those dynasts to get electable, winnable candidates. So the voter or aggregator relationship is based on patronage and lineage group affiliation, whereas the relationship between the candidate and the aggregator is a strategic alliance. That keeps on changing. That's not based on a long-term relationship. And I'll show you some evidence that these informal agents, aggregators of votes, they come from landed families or elite families, and there is a historical persistence in who is an aggregator. Along the same lines as Tim and Roger mentioned about the study, the Banerjee Iyer study from India or other places. So a lot of those have to come from colonial experiences, because the colonial experience in the areas that constitute Pakistan, especially in Punjab, involved a heavy social re-engineering through creating a hydraulic society, especially canal colonies. And there's some evidence that local colonial institutions have long-run effects on public provision outcomes, electoral outcomes. There are all these papers out there. And of elite capture by these patriarchal families. I'll show you some evidence. Survey evidence shows the number of voters, I don't have proportions here, should have proportions here, who are not aligned to a Dhada or vote faction, and those who are, so a majority of voters are aligned to a vote faction or a Dhada. But then the Dhada relationship, or the relationship of the aggregator with the candidate, is I said, why do people join an aggregator? So most of the reasons are cited. So he's a patron, he provides protection, is a part of the lineage group, which maybe provides embedded services, and all sorts of other reasons. But only 2% as member of a political party. And then the relationship of the aggregator with the candidate is a strategic electoral alliance that keeps on changing at different elections. I'll show you more evidence to show that these aggregators are dominated by colonial landed families. So landed wealth is an important channel. There is persistence in ownership of land. There is persistence in effect of ownership of land granted by the colonial institutions to current electoral and public good outcomes. As I said, they have long-run effects. So most of the aggregators, so they come from colonial proprietary families. So those families who were granted land by the Britishers, so Punjab and parts of Sindh were being canal colonies, some of the largest canal colony ever colonized in the world. Then those who were settled from outside areas to these areas, so they're roughly a century later, they are still dominate the aggregator. Difference in landed wealth between aggregators and non-aggregators. So most of the aggregators do obviously possess land. If you look into the network size of those who possess land and those who don't, so you see a big effect of land holding is positively affected to the size of their network. Is also related to social influence or social power. So I've showed you two pieces of evidence. One, which was the narrowness of the political class, those dynastic families. The other being, again, the historical persistence, but these aggregators, even at the first evidence was more at the level of the national and provincial assemblies. But even at the level below those informal aggregators, there's a high historical persistence of those informal aggregators coming from landed, historically important, powerful families. And at the level of the dynasties, as I told you, like 400 families control 2/3 of the seats in Punjab, which is the largest province. So why I think local democracy could matter in this context, call it the Meyerson, at least my faith in the untested so far, my faith in the Meyerson spillover effect, is there could be other drivers of change also that could change the nature of the political class and change that political equilibrium that co-determines political and economic development. For instance, land reform, genuine land reforms could be one. I just see no prospects of those happening. Urbanization and economic growth, but again, urbanization, yes, is happening, but economic growth being endogenously determined, I wouldn't put much faith on this one. Yes, the political parties, so the one key part of the solution is political parties realizing that they pay a huge cost by relying on these aggregators and candidates from the dynasts. And there is some evidence to show, mostly anecdotal, but we're trying to capture more rigorous evidence, that political parties also have to pay rents to these dynasts and these aggregators. And given a choice, they would ideally want to elect a candidate of their own choice who would not belong to that political class. But in the short run, and because of that my macro issue that I showed you, the instability of the political system, the political class does have very short-term political electoral horizons. So in the short run, they tend to rely on these electable candidates, even though they realize that investing in other candidates could give them high returns in the future by freeing them of the control of these groups. So where local democracy could help is by opening up the political space. We see some evidence of the very limited, very restricted local democracies that we had in Pakistan, not a test of by any means. But in theory, it could open up the political space, allow new people from outside these families, if done in steady state, not just one election or not as a part of a legitimizing strategy. This is very, very quickly. Here,
you have plenty of time.
I have plenty of time, okay. So I'm looking at these empirical effects of the last decentralization, the Musharraf regime's devolution of powers. And what we find from the data is, and this is the devolution, the decentralization increased access and entry, and that's maybe trivial given that as opposed to, say, less than 2,000 candidates from provincial and national assemblies, now you suddenly increase them by roughly 40 or 50 times, so more than 80,000. So obviously there is more access and entry into politics. We also see some evidence that local government elections are fairly competitive. There's a huge incumbency disadvantage. I'm not sure about the welfare implications. We see that roughly 40% of the mayors who were elected in 2001 lost in the 2005 elections, compared to roughly half that number from the provincial and national assemblies. In terms of their spending priorities, which is something that we are looking at the numbers, we're using a difference and difference strategy. This goes to what Tim was earlier mentioning about had I known at that time when I was part of this Ministry of Finance, helped implement this reform. Had I known at that time that I would eventually study this, I would have captured more data and maybe did it more systematically. But basically, we're using a strategy that our identifying strategy is that within each sector and each department, there is some part of the spending which is still controlled by the center after decentralization, which is the establishment part, which is the salaries and pay and salary of staff, versus the operational and new infrastructure, what is called in budgetary parlance, current non-establishment expenditure for operations and maintenance, and development expenditure for creation of new infrastructure. That was devolved to the local governments. And although there was limited scope for altering spending patterns, staffing was fixed, and that constituted a big part of the spending. And they had insignificant revenue sources. So I take Tim's point that there are spillover effects, and most of the sources of revenue should ideally perhaps be nationalized. So one of the reasons Pakistan has a low tax to GDP, low tax collection, is this logjam because of the federal nature of where they can't agree, where there are split mandates on a number of taxes, and they can't agree on. That's especially the true, and I would blame Britain for this. The 1935 Government of India Act assigned revenue assignment in a way that goods and services are assigned to different tiers of government. So goods to the federal government, central government, services to the provincial government. And ever since then, there has been a logjam into the provinces not being reluctant and not being willing to share that, or even to agree to the federal government or the Federal Board of Revenue taxing this joint base and then sharing the proceeds. And similarly, other disputes. But even purely local taxes, for instance, property tax, there could be no more local tax than the property tax. This is something that I'm also studying in another context, in the context of incentive mechanism for tax inspectors. Even property taxes are provincialized, so collected by the provincial government, and then after a number of deductions, which, sorry to say, part of what I also used to do, is and then distributed to the district government. Revenue source is not something where they had a big margin, but on spending patterns they did have at least some part of the spending, which is non-staffing. In the Musharraf regime, they had some control, and we see some changes. We see changes in the terms of like mostly their priorities accord to creation of new infrastructure schemes, especially roads are a big priority for local governments. And we are relating to the need, and we do see that there is some correspondence with local needs and spending patterns. Most of these infrastructure schemes are small and neighborhood specific. Lower priority to operations and maintenance, but that's also common to the provincial government because there's more failures of the political marketplace imply that there is more voter recognition of infrastructure schemes rather than photo ops, rather than a new infrastructure, rather than operations and maintenance. That's related, we can't establish that, but that's also related to these candidates contesting the elections on their own independent personal platforms, and with the problems of credibility and commitment between candidates and their electorates. A problem that would not have been as severe if they were political party based or partisan elections, because parties can both lug roll but also care more about their reputation in the long run. So one more thing that we see, which is important, which is different from Bolivia, is they invest mostly in new infrastructure and less so in education and health, primarily because provincial politicians consider them the rival sources of patronage, so they institute parallel vertical programs in education and health. And now with the presence of all those separate programs in health and education, but they kind of like those vertical programs instituted by the provincial government the evidence has suggested that they seem to have like sucked out the political space out of these sectors. So the local politicians, in order to discriminate themselves from the provincial government or the other tier of government, had to choose some other area, which in this case used to be creation of infrastructure, to distinguish their contribution or their performance from the provincial government. So I don't read too much into these, but I read that partly these results are a reflection of the distorted incentives that the provincial governments face, the local governments face. With Meyerson, Ali, we have argued with the authorities and with other policymakers in Pakistan that not only do we need local democracy in Pakistan, but what we need is obviously partisan elections, political party-based elections. We have tried to take part in that debate and help move that debate, and not just as an academic, but as active players. I think I said most of this before. What we have engaged with the different governments is to encourage political party-based elections, because parties can choose better candidates and get in touch with voters. Also a system of proportional representation because as we show in one of those papers, that single non-transferable votes of the type that were instituted in the previous electoral regimes are game-proof and are subject to accountability by a very narrow set of voters. And if you want to build more accountability, and again accountability through the political parties, what we suggest is approval voting, open list, proportional representation system, parliamentary system at all tiers, accountability to a broad set of voters, and most importantly, clarity as to who has political responsibility for running district authorities. One slide before I go to my last point. Current developments. So current developments in Pakistan, despite all that negative history of the state building, is a little less negative, or there are some positive that I see. As I mentioned, for the first time that we saw a unique, peaceful transition between civil regimes. And as has been claimed, that the true test of democracy is when an incumbent loses election and peacefully transfers power to another. That happened for the first time in Pakistan earlier this year. And to the extent that that can ease or some of the constraints on that macro question, which is the primary determining question in Pakistan's politics, which is the institutional imbalance or conflict between the elected and unelected organs of the state, is possibly going to have positive effects. For the first time in Pakistan history, what we are witnessing is establishment of local governments under democratic regimes. So laws have been passed, and we're going to see elections very soon. And what we are also seeing is partisan elections, political party-based elections for the first time in Pakistan's history. Again, with some nudging, some of those constraints to local democracy are still there, that provincial politicians, the national politicians do consider local politicians as rival sources for patronage. And they're not very keen, obviously, to also to see this entry effect of people entering into politics, building their reputation and challenging them. So these partisan elections were to a large extent forced by higher judicial decisions, especially Supreme Court decisions, which forced those on, especially the most recalcitrant government, which is the Punjab government, which we didn't want to do. Ali and I interacted a lot with all three governments and on these. And what we also see, which is positive currently, is space for at least yardstick competition between different political governments in Pakistan. For the first time, all four provinces are ruled by different political parties. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa by Imran Khan's party, Punjab by PMLN, Sindh by PPP, Balochistan by a coalition government. And we do see, as should have been the case, unlike in the military regimes, where they had a cookie-cutter approach to local government, they had the same local government ordinance, despite changes, despite heterogeneity in all four provinces. We do see, which is positive, variation in local government laws across provinces and institutional innovations that we do hope that will lead to some better outcomes. On the negative side, most of those, except possibly for the PTI, Tehreek-e-Insaf-led government in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, all of those local governments have restricted mandates, somewhat fuzzy accountability patterns, and so these still provide limited space for local leaders to demonstrate their reputation for good governance. And the other question, especially for the most promising one, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa one, especially, is the looming threat from insurgent groups, the Tehreek-e-Taliban in particular. That's what I will next discuss before ending. The Taliban threat and what local democracy has the linkage of local democracy to this one. Because in case of Pakistan, as true to Tim and Torsten's analysis, political, economic development and violence, both by the state and other actors, are co-determined. So the first point here is the nature of the threat from the Tehreek-e-Taliban is fundamentally very different from any other threat that the state of Pakistan has faced. There have been other threats, secessionist threats, also ideological other threats, but none of them have challenged the the rational legal authority of the state. So they either want to create a separate state, again, but on the same structures as before, or want to change the direction of the state in some ways, but not the rational legal character. The constitutive organs of the state are not challenged. So this is the only challenge that is radical enough to change the entire basis of the state. What contributes to its origin, besides geostrategic development, especially Afghan jihad, as you all know, and theological developments, the rise of Takfiri groups. By this I mean that most of the Pakistanis are Brelvis or followers of either Brelvi, which is call it syncretic, follows the Peers and others, or some of them mystics and others, follow the mystic traditions and others, and not hardline, hardcore fundamentalist groups. However, past 30 to 40 years, there has been an increasing aggressive proselytization by Wahhabi finance inspired by groups who are motivated by what I would call Takfiri ideology. Takfiri ideology means following Ibn Taymiyyah from the 14th century, who provided a ideological justification of why in the struggle to establish an Islamic state, jihad could be done against other Muslims, even without the concurrence or under the banner of the state. Past 30 years, we have seen increasing aggressive proselytization, Saudi petrodollars and others. But apart from these factors, which are very important factors, what also contributed to the growth of violence and growth of the rise of these groups is incomplete institutional incorporation of FATA and other areas. So that's not only true for FATA and tribal areas. So roughly 1/3 of Pakistan by area, most of Balochistan and others. Most of Balochistan, except for Quetta city, is still B area, where levies and other, where the normal rules of the state don't apply. And FATA in particular is very different. So this coexistence and intermingling of formal and informal spaces existed throughout Pakistan, even in settled areas, even in Punjab and others, where it was established by the colonial regimes to create a structure of governance where the state could co-opt with informal structures, which are not outside the state, but were created or established by the state to co-opt local elites and to rule through them. So zamindars, namirdars being one example, being some of the example. But the most extreme form of that is in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the tribal areas and parts of Balochistan, where the normal rules of the state do not apply, and the state was actively operating through these khans and maliks. So, few examples: political parties have historically not been allowed to operate. The Political Parties Representation Act was only extended to tribal areas in 2011. Still no political parties operate there, although they're now legally allowed. Just a couple of years ago, they were not even legally allowed to operate there. And so the whole area was ruled through political agents and tribal chiefs, khans and maliks, the tribal chiefs who were paid by the state and who did the functions of the state through governed by the political agents. A system of collective punishment, no habeas corpus. Individual crimes are punished through collective. The whole tribe is basically punished for individual crimes through what was called the Frontier Crimes Regulation, which has in theory been disbanded only a couple of years ago, but not in practice. In fact, the key solution that the security establishment in Pakistan wants is this system has weakened and they want to re-establish this. And I'm arguing that this system was suboptimal but worked for a while, but has already been destroyed by a number of shocks. Afghan war being one shock, economic shocks, both destruction of the economic base of this, and rise of other sources of rent, drugs trade, arms smuggling, others, have already destroyed the system. So a recreation of the system is rather than recreating a system which is backward looking, what I'm arguing is recreation of creation of political extension of political representation through local democracy being one of the could be part of the solution here. So how, and to go into other reasons of rise of I don't have time to go into these, is the social origin or institutional dynamics of the rise of the fundamentalist or extremist groups here, as has been studied by many people, including these, primarily occurred through encroachment of clerics onto the space of arbitration and dispute resolutions. That's not just true for Pakistan, so that's true for many other areas, even Somalia, Nigeria, other Somalia, the major extremist movement is Sharia courts movement. Because of their historical role in such tribal traditional societies and there being absent formal arbitration and dispute resolution systems, and these areas not being completely institutionally incorporated into the formal writ of the state. So the first area that and that's not just true for this, FATA, but also Swat and other areas, was take over the legitimizing instrument of the state in terms of arbitration and dispute resolution, where clerics argued that their personal piety makes them a better arbiter and resolver of dispute compared to an ineffective state and judicial system, and Khans and Maliks who are corrupt and siding with the state. So that's exactly how it happened in Swat, where the movement is still named Tehreek-e-Nafaz Shariat-e-Muhammadi, which is a movement to establish Muhammad Shariat in Swat. Again, started off from the major their claim being that the system of judicial system should be based on Sharia, especially the court system, and following from that other organs of the state. What has not happened is, so far in these areas, is economic dimension of contest over lands, which were traditionally dispersed by these Maliks and Khans who were both in charge a bit because of their genealogical myths and their traditional role in these tribal societies, who were both had a major role in distribution of internal rents, so common property resources and other rents, but also external rents that flowed from the state to the tribe. So they were the arbiters or the interlocutors between the state and the local people in terms of both external rents, but also internal rents that the tribal societies generated. That structure is destroyed in almost all of those places. So the Taliban have systematically gone after Khans and Maliks. The dispute resolution and arbitration functions are already challenged and replaced by these other courts. But what I'm arguing here is, rather than making an attempt at recreating a system that lost its legitimacy and that was destroyed, which is a system of interlocutors between the state and the tribal people, which is the case in Swat and most of these tribal areas. What we need is, and only at a time maybe when peace is established, right now is not the time, political initiatives that create credible representation of the people, and local democracy could be the starting point for that. That could already be done in Swat, where after the defeat of the insurgency, so far no political initiative has been taken, and what the state is doing is basically trying to recreate an older structure that had basically lost its legitimacy and that was no longer functional. So in historical terms, there is a class dimension to the rise of Taliban also, because they are from lower classes, and because the whole system was fossilized for 50 to 60 years, in that the system did not allow economic and social changes to be institutionalized in politics, because there was no system for representative politics. So the only option left with and that system was changed because of the major economic, socio-economic development, but also external shocks, wars, and others. So Khans and Maliks already lost their legitimacy. That old fossilized system no longer represented the reality on the ground also, where there were both changes instituted by wars and external shocks, but also political and socio-economic developments. So Taliban, in some sense, in the eyes of those, many of those people, so they view many of them as like Che Guevarans, or like people from outside the political system who are trying to create a more egalitarian system, is one of the appeals. I don't buy that, but that constitutes at least one of the appeals of the Taliban. So let me finish it. That's my last slide. I think I've already said the implications of the case, the Pakistan case for state building are democracy obviously is an important precondition for state building. Pakistan's history demonstrates that centralized and non-representative regimes create setbacks, they reduce the space for political bargains. Political and state elites' inability to achieve consensus affects state building, political instability creates local level violence and conflict, and that quality of local leadership matters. So the selection effect is, in my view at least, is a major explanation of why there is dysfunctional politics in Pakistan. I'm not saying this is the only explanation or the only solution. Rise of middle class, cadre-based, or political parties, strong political parties, economic growth, but all of those are being endogenous. I do see that local democracy and entry of new political leadership into the democratic system does constitute at least a part of the solution to break this low-level equilibrium. Thank you.